If someone had told me a year ago that the man whose life I observed through a window would one day be sleeping in my bed, I would have laughed. Not a real laugh, but the dry, brittle kind I reserve for impossible things. My life was a meticulously curated collection of quiet moments, a fortress built of routine and solitude. And Marcus, my neighbor, was the king of the world outside my walls, a world I only watched. He was a story I told myself, not a person I could ever actually know. My apartment was my sanctuary. 2 rooms, perfectly ordered. Books alphabetized, then organized by color. Mugs hanging on hooks in a precise row. My desk, facing the window, was the cockpit from which I navigated my small, digital world as a freelance designer. It was also my observation deck. From that chair, I watched the seasons change in Marcus's front yard. I watched him mow the lawn in the summer, his back muscles bunching under a sweat-soaked t-shirt. I watched him rake leaves in the autumn, a grim set to his jaw as the wind undid his work. I watched him shovel snow in the winter, his breath pluming in the frigid air like a dragon's. He was a man of action, a man of physical presence. He was tall, broad, with hands that looked like they could fix an engine or split a log without a second thought. He was everything I was not. I was a man of pixels and keystrokes, of quiet contemplation and carefully measured sentences. And he was married. Sarah, his wife, was a fleeting character in the movie of their life. I saw her less often. A flash of blonde hair getting into a car. A silhouette in their brightly lit kitchen window. They looked, from my vantage point, like the perfect picture of suburban contentment. The successful contractor and his lovely wife. A life built on solid, traditional ground. Our interactions were a masterclass in brevity. A curt nod as he got the mail. A raised hand from behind the wheel of his truck. We were neighbors in proximity only. An unbreachable canyon of lifestyle, of presumed orientation, of everything, lay between my front door and his. He was a fact of my landscape, as permanent and as distant as the oak tree on the corner. My longing for him was a secret garden I tended in the dark. It was a quiet, hopeless thing, a low hum beneath the surface of my orderly life. It demanded nothing. It expected nothing. It was simply there, a part of the architecture of my loneliness. I never imagined the walls of my fortress would be breached, and certainly not by a knock on the door during a biblical thunderstorm for a cup of sugar. The storm had arrived without subtlety, clawing at the sky with jagged bolts of lightning. The rain came down not in sheets, but in solid, roaring walls of water. My building flickered twice, a warning shot, before the power gave up entirely, plunging my world into a sudden, deep twilight. I wasn't panicked. I was prepared. My life was a series of contingency plans. I had candles in the drawer, a battery-powered radio, and a stack of books I'd been meaning to read. The sudden silence, broken only by the storm's fury, was almost peaceful. It was an enforced disconnection from the world, a mandatory retreat. My routine was disrupted, but it was a disruption I could control. I lit a few candles, their flames dancing and throwing long, distorted shadows across the walls. My small apartment felt like a cave, a safe pocket in the heart of the tempest. I was settling into a chair with a novel when the sound came. A frantic, percussive banging, not a polite knock. It was the sound of someone desperate to get in. My heart, that frantic, trapped bird, hammered against my ribs. No one ever came to my door, especially not in a storm like this. My mind raced through a list of terrible possibilities. A neighbor in trouble. A stranger. Danger. I crept to the door, my bare feet silent on the cool wood floor. I peered through the peephole, the fisheye lens distorting the frantic energy on the other side. It was Marcus. Soaked. Utterly, completely drenched. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and water streamed down his face, carving paths through the day's grime. He wasn't wearing a jacket, just a thin Henley that clung to the solid planes of his chest and shoulders, rendered nearly transparent by the rain. He looked huge and wild and utterly out of place. He banged again, harder this time. My hand trembled as I unfastened the deadbolt. This was a breach of protocol, a disruption of the highest order. The carefully maintained distance between our worlds was about to collapse. I opened the door a crack. The wind howled, trying to shove its way inside, carrying the scent of rain and wet earth and something else. Something that was just him. Marcus. My voice was a croak. He squinted, his eyes adjusting to the dim candlelight. Arthur, I nodded, incapable of speech. He had never said my name before. I wasn't sure he even knew it. Look, I'm sorry to bother you, man. This is going to sound insane. He ran a hand through his wet hair, slicking it back. Do you have any sugar I could borrow? Sugar. Of all the things. My brain stalled, trying to process the absurdity. The world was ending outside, and the man from my window-gazing daydreams was on my doorstep asking for a household commodity. Sugar. I repeated, my voice still thin. Yeah, I know. It's stupid. He looked past me, into the flickering warmth of my apartment, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not just urgency. Desperation. He was shivering, a fine tremor running through his large frame. My carefully constructed solitude suddenly felt like selfishness. Get in, I said, my voice finding its footing. Get inside before you drown. I opened the door wider, and he hesitated for only a second before stumbling in. He brought the storm with him. The smell of rain, the chill in the air. He stood dripping on my welcome mat, a titan crammed into my meticulously ordered world. He seemed to take up all the air, all the space. The silence in the room was no longer peaceful. It was charged, heavy with his presence. He looked around, his gaze sweeping over my books, my clean surfaces, the pools of candlelight. He looked like a wild animal that had accidentally wandered into a dollhouse. Awkward, overwhelming, and beautiful. Power's out everywhere, I guess, he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It went out about 10 minutes ago. I confirmed, my own voice sounding ridiculously formal. I was a tour guide in my own home. Let me get you a towel. And the sugar. It was a lie, the sugar. A flimsy, transparent excuse. As I moved toward the kitchen, my mind finally caught up. Why would he need sugar in the middle of a blackout? For coffee he couldn't brew? For cake he couldn't bake? The absurdity of it was a bright, flashing light. He wasn't here for sugar. He was here for refuge. I grabbed a clean, fluffy towel from the linen closet, one of the good ones I never used. When I turned back, he was standing in the same spot, arms wrapped around himself, still shivering. The puddle on the mat around his work boots was growing. Here, I said, holding out the towel. He reached for it, and his fingers brushed against mine. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental contact. But a jolt went through me, sharp and hot, like a stray spark from a live wire. My skin tingled where he'd touched it. My breath hitched. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. I hoped the dim light hid the flush I could feel creeping up my neck. He didn't seem to notice. Or, if he did, he gave no sign. He just took the towel and began to roughly dry his hair, the motion powerful and efficient. I watched the play of muscles in his forearms, the way the damp fabric of his shirt pulled taut across his back. This was too much. He was too much. Too close. Too real. The fantasy from my window had walked through my door and was now dripping on my floor, and I had no idea what the script was. So I started trying to sound casual, my voice tight. Big plans for all that sugar. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first I'd ever seen up close. It changed his entire face, softening the harsh lines. Right, the sugar, he sighed, a heavy, weary sound, and dropped the towel onto his shoulders. He looked me straight in the eye. There's no sugar, man. I'm sorry. I lied, and there it was. The truth. Or at least the beginning of it. My phone's dead, he continued, his voice dropping lower. And I'm locked out. Saris, she's not here. She's out of town. I was coming home from a job site, got caught in this, and my keys are in the truck, but the damn electronic fob is on the fritz. I think the battery died. I can't get in the truck to get the house key. He laid it all out, a cascade of mundane disasters that had culminated in him seeking shelter with a quiet stranger next door. He looked embarrassed, vulnerable. It was an expression I had never seen on his face. From my window, he was always confident, in control. Now, standing in my living room, he just looked lost. This I could handle. This was a problem with a solution. A practical matter. It was safer territory than the unspoken thing that had sparked between us when our hands touched. "You can stay here," I said, the words coming out before I had a chance to second-guess them. "Until the storm passes. Or until you can get into your house." He looked relieved. The tension in his massive shoulders seemed to lessen by a fraction. "You sure?" "I don't want to impose. It's not an imposition. It's a hurricane out there." I gestured vaguely at the window, where rain was lashing against the glass. "You need to get out of those wet clothes. You'll catch your death." My own words hung in the air. Get out of those wet clothes. It sounded far more intimate than I intended. A fresh wave of heat washed over me. I turned away, busying myself with lighting another candle to hide my face. "I don't really have anything that would fit you," I said, my voice slightly muffled as I focused on the wick. "But you could hang your things to dry. I have a bathrobe." The thought of Marcus in my bathrobe was both horrifying and thrilling. It would be ridiculously small on him. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "A bathrobe, huh? I think I'll just stick with the wet clothes." "But thanks." He started to peel the sodden Henley off over his head. And I froze. My living room was no longer just my living room. It was an art gallery, and the statue of a Greek god had just come to life in the center of it. His skin, slick with rain, gleamed in the candlelight. He was broader than I'd even imagined, a landscape of muscle and sinew. There were old scars I'd never seen from my window, a pale, jagged line across his ribs, a small, puckered mark on his shoulder. Tattoos snaked down his left arm, dark ink against his skin, patterns I couldn't quite make out in the flickering light. He was a map of a life lived hard, a life lived in the physical world. He wrung out the shirt with a powerful twist of his wrists and looked around for a place to put it. "Here," I croaked, taking the wet garment from him. Our fingers brushed again. This time the spark was stronger. I felt it travel all the way up my arm, a warm current that settled deep in my chest. I retreated quickly, draping his shirt over the back of a kitchen chair. He stood there, bare-chested in my candlelit apartment. The air was thick with unspoken things. The storm outside raged, but the real tempest was in here, in the 10 feet of space between us. The carefully maintained distance had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. "I can make some tea," I offered, desperate for something to do with my hands, somewhere to look other than at the expanse of his chest. "It's all I can do without power." "Kettle on the gas stove, tea would be great," he said, his voice softer now. "Thanks." "Arthur," he said my name again. It sounded different in the quiet of the room. It sounded like an anchor in the swirling chaos of my thoughts. I went into the small kitchen, my movements stiff and awkward. I felt his eyes on me as I filled the kettle, my hands shaking so badly I sloshed water onto the counter. My heart was a frantic, wild thing, beating a rhythm against my ribs that was completely out of sync with the slow, methodical life I had built. He was in my space. He was half naked in my space. And he had come to me for help. The power dynamic, the one where he was the king of the world and I was the invisible observer, had been completely upended. Here, in my cave, in my sanctuary, I was the one with the fire. I was the one with the tea. And he was the one who was cold and locked out. As I waited for the water to boil, listening to the small hiss of the gas flame, I watched him from the corner of my eye. He had settled onto the edge of my sofa, leaning forward, his powerful forearms resting on his knees. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at the floor, his expression unreadable in the dancing shadows. The confidence I'd always associated with him, the easy swagger, was gone. In its place was a profound weariness, a deep, bone-crushing exhaustion that seemed to emanate from him in waves. For the first time, I didn't see the idealized man from my window. I saw a person, a tired, cold, and lonely person, and my hopeless, secret longing began to morph into something else, something more complicated and far more dangerous. Empathy. The kettle whistled, a shrill cry that cut through the sound of the storm. I poured the hot water into 2 mugs, the steam warming my face. I chose the plain blue mug for him, the one without any chips. I dropped a bag of chamomile tea into his, something to calm him, something to calm me. I carried the mugs back into the living room. He looked up as I approached, his eyes dark and deep. I handed him his mug, careful this time not to touch him. Our hands were inches apart, the heat from the ceramic radiating between them. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low murmur. He cradled the mug in his large hands, as if seeking its warmth. I sat in the armchair opposite the sofa, putting a safe distance between us. The silence stretched, filled only by the storm and the soft clink of his mug against his teeth as he took a sip. "So," I began, needing to fill the void, "Sarah's out of town for long?" It was a simple, neighborly question, but the effect it had on him was immediate and stark. His whole body tensed. The weariness in his face hardened into something else, something that looked like pain. He stared into his mug for a long moment before he answered. "She's not out of town, Arthur." He finally looked at me, and his gaze was raw, stripped of all pretense. "She's gone. We separated 3 weeks ago. She's staying with her sister across the state." The confession landed in the quiet room like a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples spread out, changing everything. The perfect picture I had painted in my head, the one of the happy, suburban couple, shattered into a million pieces. "Oh, it was all I could manage. I'm sorry." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Don't be. It was overdue." He took another sip of tea. "I've just been keeping up appearances. Mowing the lawn. Bringing in the empty trash cans. Didn't want the whole neighborhood gossiping." He looked at me pointedly. "Didn't want the guy in the window thinking the king had lost his castle." My blood ran cold. He knew. He knew I watched him. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. My secret observations were not secret at all. I was not an invisible voyeur. I was the guy in the window, my face burned with a humiliating heat. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. I stammered, my throat tight. "I didn't mean to." "Hey," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He leaned forward, his expression softening. "It's okay. I get it. You're a quiet guy. You keep to yourself." He paused, looking around my apartment again. "You've got your world in here. It's nice." He looked back at me. "Sometimes, when I was out there, dealing with all the noise, I'd look up at your window. Your light would be on. I knew you were in here, in the quiet. And I was jealous. He was jealous of me, of my solitude, of my fortress." The idea was so preposterous, so utterly backward, that I couldn't process it. He was Marcus, the man who had it all. I was Arthur, the man who watched from the sidelines. The roles were fixed. They were not supposed to reverse. "You were," I whispered. "My house isn't a home, Arthur. It hasn't been for a long time. It's just a big, empty box full of arguments we never finished and things we bought to pretend we were happy." His voice was rough with emotion. "It's loud, even when it's silent. Your place." He looked around again. "It feels calm." The room was filled with his confession. It was a raw, vulnerable thing, lying there between us in the candlelight. He had taken the carefully constructed image I had of him and torn it down with his bare hands. And in its place, he had shown me the real man. Someone lonely, someone hurting, someone who felt just as trapped as I did, but in a different kind of cage. The distance between us was gone. Not just the physical few feet, but the miles of misunderstanding and false perception. He wasn't the king of a world I couldn't enter. He was just a man, sitting in the dark, telling his secrets to the only person he could. I didn't know what to say. The carefully measured sentences I usually relied on failed me. So I just listened. He talked for what felt like hours. He talked about the slow, quiet decay of his marriage, the pressure to live up to an image, the crushing loneliness of sharing a bed with someone who felt like a stranger. He didn't unload, he unburdened. Each word seemed to make him a little lighter, a little less weary. And I, the quiet observer, became the keeper of his story. My role had shifted. I was no longer just watching a movie. I was in it. The storm outside began to subside, its fury lessening to a steady, drumming rain. The candles burned lower, the wax pooling at their bases. The tea in our mugs grew cold, but the warmth between us grew. It was a fragile, tentative thing, built of shared secrets and newfound understanding. At some point, he fell silent. He just sat there, staring into his empty mug, looking utterly spent. The energy that had held him together seemed to have finally drained away. "You can take the bed," I said softly, breaking the quiet. He looked up, his eyes glassy with exhaustion. No, man, I can't. I'll take the sofa. The sofa is a medieval torture device, I said, a small smile touching my lips. I'm a designer, not a furniture connoisseur. Trust me, you're 6 foot whatever. You won't fit. Take the bed. I'll be fine here. We argued for a minute, a quiet, tired debate. But he was too exhausted to put up much of a fight. He finally relented with a grateful nod. I gave him a spare t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants, knowing they would be comically small. I pointed him toward the bathroom and then went to my bedroom to change the sheets, my hands moving on autopilot. My bedroom, my most private space. The thought of him being in there in my bed was overwhelming. The air felt thin, hard to breathe. I smoothed the clean, cool cotton of his sheets, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. When he came out of the bathroom, he looked different. My gray t-shirt was stretched tight across his chest, and the sweatpants ended halfway down his shins. He looked absurd, like a giant who had stolen a child's clothes. But he also looked softer, the hard edges smoothed away. He looked like someone who belonged in a home, not just a house. Thanks, he mumbled, avoiding my eyes. He was suddenly shy. The big, confident contractor was gone, replaced by this uncertain, vulnerable man. It's no problem, I said quietly. Sleep well. He nodded and disappeared into my bedroom, closing the door softly behind him. I stood alone in my living room, the dying candles casting flickering shadows on the walls. The apartment felt impossibly large and empty without him in it, even though he was just one room away. The silence he had praised earlier descended again, but it was different now. It was filled with the ghost of his voice, the memory of his confession, the weight of his presence in my bed. I sank onto the torture device sofa and pulled a thin blanket over myself. Sleep felt like a distant country I had no hope of reaching. My mind was a dizzying whirlwind of the night's events. The knock, the rain, the touch of his hand, his bare chest, his secrets. He knew I watched him, and he wasn't angry. He was jealous. That one thought kept circling, refusing to land. It changed the entire narrative of the past year. I wasn't a lonely creep. I was a point of solace, an object of envy. It was too much to comprehend. I lay there in the dark, listening to the rain and the quiet sounds of another person breathing in my home. And for the first time in a very long time, my fortress of solitude didn't feel safe. It felt like a prison I had only just realized I was in. And Marcus, the man in my bed, had just handed me the key. I didn't know if I was brave enough to use it. Sometime in the deep, dark hours of the morning, I must have drifted off. It was a thin, restless sleep populated by dreams of storms and open doors. I was jolted awake not by a sound, but by a change in the atmosphere. A presence. My eyes snapped open. The rain had stopped. A pale, pre-dawn light filtered through the window, and Marcus was standing in the doorway of my bedroom, a silhouette against the faint light. My heart leaped into my throat. Is everything okay? I whispered, my voice thick with sleep. He didn't answer for a moment. He just stood there, watching me. Then he moved, walking slowly toward the sofa. I couldn't sleep, he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. Your bed is too comfortable, too quiet. He stopped a few feet away from me. Can I? He gestured vaguely at the floor beside the sofa. I don't want to be alone. The request was so simple, so raw, it stole the air from my lungs. He wasn't asking for comfort or conversation. He was asking for presence. He was asking not to be lonely. It was a feeling I knew down in my bones. Okay, I breathed. He didn't lie on the floor. He sank down to his knees beside the sofa, so he was level with me. The faint light caught the lines of his face. He looked exhausted and young and impossibly sad. We stayed like that for a long time, in the quiet gray of the approaching dawn. Not talking, just breathing in the same small space. The charged energy from the night before had dissipated, replaced by a deep, calm stillness. It felt less like a seduction and more like a vigil. Two lonely people, keeping watch together in the dark. I see the way you look at me, he said, his voice so quiet I almost thought I imagined it. My entire body went rigid. Here it was. The confrontation. The rejection. He continued, his gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance. When I'm out in the yard, or getting the mail, it's not creepy. I don't know. It's like you're the only one who actually sees me. Everyone else sees the truck, the house, the wife. The contractor, they see the costume. You see me. The guy who's tired of pretending. My breath was trapped in my chest, a painful, burning knot. He finally turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were clear and direct in the dim light. I've been pretending for a long time, Arthur. About everything. He reached out, his movements slow, deliberate. He placed his hand on the sofa next to my head. His fingers were inches from my face. I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. I could smell the scent of my soap on him. What are you pretending about now? I whispered, my voice trembling. A long, shuddering breath escaped him. I don't want to kiss you. And the world stopped. The birds outside hadn't started singing yet. The city was still asleep. The universe had narrowed to this single moment, this single confession, hanging in the air between us. He was waiting. He wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding. He was asking. His eyes searched mine for an answer. My fear was a cold, heavy stone in my stomach. Fear of what this meant, fear of being wrong, fear of 100 different kinds of heartbreak. But underneath the fear was the longing, the secret garden I had tended for so long. And it was finally, impossibly blooming. I gave the slightest nod, a barely perceptible movement, but it was enough. He leaned in, closing the small distance between us. His lips met mine, and it was nothing like I had ever imagined. It wasn't fierce or passionate. It was slow, hesitant. It was a question. It was tentative and soft and searching. It tasted of chamomile tea and rain and a loneliness so profound it broke my heart. I responded, my own fear melting away, replaced by a tidal wave of feeling. All the months of watching, of yearning, of quiet desperation poured into that one simple touch. My hand came up to cup the back of his neck, my fingers tangling in his short, damp hair. His skin was warm. He was real. This was real. He made a sound, a low groan deep in his chest, and the kiss deepened. It was still gentle, but now there was a desperate, hungry edge to it. A need. It was the kiss of a man who had been starving for something he didn't even know he was allowed to want. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. His hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking gently over my cheek. Everything, he whispered, his voice thick. I've been pretending about everything. We didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to say. He stood up and gently pulled me to my feet. He led me back to the bedroom, back to my bed. We crawled under the covers, the clean sheets cool against our skin. He pulled me against him, my back to his chest, and wrapped his arms around me. His body was a furnace, a solid, grounding presence. I lay there, tucked into the curve of his body, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart against my back. The fear was gone. The anxiety was gone. In their place was a quiet, fragile, and terrifying hope. I fell asleep in the arms of the man from the window, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel alone in my fortress. I felt home. I woke to the sound of birdsong and the bright, unforgiving light of morning streaming through the window. The storm had scrubbed the world clean. The air was fresh, and the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. For a blissful, disoriented moment, I felt a deep sense of peace. My body was warm, held securely. The scent of him, of soap and sleep and man, was all around me. I was not alone. Then memory came rushing back in, a cold, brutal shock. The kiss. His arms around me. His confession. I opened my eyes. The space beside me in the bed was empty. The indentation of his head was still on the pillow. The sheet was still thrown back where he had lain. But he was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. A familiar dread filled my stomach, a sensation like swallowing broken glass. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Marcus!" I called out, my voice a weak croak. Silence. The apartment was utterly, profoundly silent. I scrambled out of bed, my bare feet cold on the floor. I rushed into the living room. It was empty. The sofa was neat, the blanket I had used folded carefully on top. The 2 mugs from a night before were gone from the coffee table. I darted into the kitchen. The mugs were in the sink, rinsed clean. His damn clothes were gone from the back of the chair. The towel he had used was gone. It was as if he had never been here. No, that wasn't true. The only evidence of his presence was the neatly folded pile of my t-shirt and sweatpants on the kitchen counter, and beside them, a single, perfect line of white crystals. Sugar. He had spilled a little bit of sugar. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat, a dry, painful sound. He'd come for sugar, and he'd left some behind. It was a cruel, twisted joke. The morning after anxiety hit me like a physical blow. I leaned against the counter, my legs weak. My mind became a torture chamber, replaying every moment from the night before, twisting it, dissecting it, finding all the ways I had been a fool. He had been vulnerable, desperate. He'd been in the middle of a crisis, his marriage falling apart, locked out in a storm. I wasn't a source of comfort. I was a port in that storm, an opportunistic moment of weakness, a mistake. The kiss wasn't a beginning. It was a symptom of his chaos, a desperate grasp for any kind of human connection in a moment of utter loneliness. And now, in the clear, bright light of day, he was gone. He had woken up, realized what he'd done, and fled. Overcome with regret, with disgust. I was the guy in the window again. But now I was worse. I was the guy in the window who had taken advantage. The quiet, creepy neighbor who had capitalized on a moment of weakness. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I had crossed a line. I had let him in, not just into my apartment, but into my life, and in doing so, I had shattered the fragile piece of my own existence. Now, every time I looked out my window, I wouldn't feel a quiet longing. I would feel this gut-wrenching, humiliating sickness. I had to get out. I couldn't be in this apartment, in this space that was so full of his ghost. I dressed quickly, not bothering to shower, and fled. I walked for hours, with no destination in mind. I just walked, trying to outrun the frantic, looping thoughts in my head. The city was waking up around me. People were heading to work, drinking coffee, living their normal lives. Their worlds hadn't been turned upside down by a lie about sugar and a desperate, rain-soaked kiss. When I finally returned to my building in the late afternoon, exhausted and hollowed out, I saw his truck parked in its usual spot. A sign of life. A sign that he was back in his world, and I was back in mine. The canyon between our houses felt wider and deeper than ever before. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxious silence. Every creak of my floorboards, every distant car door slam, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept expecting a knock, an angry confrontation, a quiet, pitying apology. Nothing came. The silence was worse than any confrontation. It was a confirmation of my fears. I was a footnote in his bad night, an embarrassing incident to be forgotten. The quiet of my apartment, which had once been a comfort, was now a roaring void, filled with the absence of him. My solitude was no longer a choice. It was a sentence. The next day was the same. A long, agonizing stretch of silence. I kept my blinds closed. I couldn't bear to look out the window, to see him moving about his yard, pretending last night never happened. The not knowing was eating me alive. I tried to work, but the pixels on my screen swam before my eyes. I tried to read, but the words were just black marks on a page. My carefully ordered world was in chaos, and I had no idea how to fix it. I had let the storm in, and it had wrecked everything. By the second night, I had resigned myself to the new reality. I had to rebuild my fortress. I had to forget the feel of his lips, the weight of his arm around me, the sound of his heart beating against my back. It was a moment out of time, a strange dream brought on by the storm. Now the sun was out. It was over. I was sitting in the dark, nursing a glass of whiskey when a knock came. It was a soft knock this time, hesitant, not the frantic banging of storm. My blood turned to ice. My heart stopped, then started again with a painful, violent lurch. It couldn't be. I didn't move. I sat there, frozen, hoping that if I stayed silent, whoever it was would go away. That he would go away. The knock came again, a little more insistent. "Arthur, it's me. It's Marcus. Please, can we talk?" His voice was muffled through the door, but it was unmistakably him, and it was filled with an emotion I couldn't place. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pity. It was strained. My body moved before my brain could object. I was a puppet pulled by invisible strings of hope and fear. I walked to the door, my legs unsteady. I looked through the peephole. He was there. He wasn't soaked this time. He was wearing clean jeans and a dark sweater. But he looked worse than he had in the storm. His face was pale, his eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, and there was a tension in his jaw that spoke of sleepless nights and grinding anxiety. He looked wrecked. My hand hovered over the lock. This was a mistake. I should leave the door closed. I should preserve what little was left of my self-respect. But I couldn't. I opened the door. He stood there, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low. I stepped back, holding the door open. He walked in, and the apartment was once again filled with his presence. But this time, it wasn't overwhelming. It was heavy, weighed down by 2 days of silence and misunderstanding. He stopped in the middle of the room, turning to face me. "I'm so sorry," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "Arthur, I am so sorry for what?" I asked, my voice flat. I was protecting myself, wrapping my heart in layers of ice. "For leaving," he said, finally looking at me. His eyes were filled with a desperate, pleading anguish. "For just disappearing like that. It was a cowardly thing to do. It was a horrible thing to do. And I've been kicking myself for 2 straight days." I just stared at him, saying nothing, giving him nothing. He took a step closer. "I woke up," he said, his voice cracking. "I woke up, and you were there, asleep, and the sun was coming up, and for the first time in years. I felt okay. I felt peaceful, and it terrified me." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. "Everything in my life has been a loud, complicated mess. And that moment with you was quiet, and simple, and real, and my brain just short-circuited. All I could think was that I was going to ruin it, that I was going to bring all my chaos, my drama, my mess into your quiet world and destroy it. So I ran." He took another step. We were only a few feet apart now. "I wasn't running from you, Arthur. I swear to God. I was running from myself. From how much I wanted to stay, the ice around my heart began to crack. A tiny, fragile shoot of hope pushed its way through. I spent the last 2 days trying to convince myself it was a mistake," he continued, his voice raw. "That it was the storm, the whiskey, the loneliness. I tried to tell myself to just leave you alone, to go back to pretending. But I can't. The silence from my house, it's nothing compared to the silence from yours. Knowing you were in here, thinking I was, I don't know, some kind of monster. It's been hell." He looked at me, his soul bare in his eyes. "What happened between us, it wasn't a mistake. It was the most real thing that's happened to me in a decade. And I am terrified. I have no idea what I'm doing. My life is a complete disaster area. But I don't want to go back to pretending. And I don't want to do it without you." The confession, his second in as many days, settled in the air between us. This one was even more terrifying, even more profound than the first. He wasn't just admitting his loneliness. He was admitting his feelings. He was admitting his fear. He was asking for a chance. My own fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. This was messy. This was complicated. This was everything my orderly life was designed to avoid. But the thought of sending him away, of returning to my silent, empty fortress, was infinitely more terrifying. "I thought you regretted it," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I thought you were disgusted." "No," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He closed the remaining distance between us and gently, tentatively, took my hand. His was warm and calloused, engulfing mine. The spark was still there, a steady, humming current. Never. How could I regret the first honest moment I've had in years? He lifted my hand and pressed a soft, chaste kiss to my knuckles. He kept his eyes on mine as he did it. "I'm not asking you to fix my life, Arthur. It's my mess to clean up. I'm just asking if I can clean it up from here. With you, it wasn't a promise of a perfect future. It was an admission of a chaotic present and a hope for something better. It was honest and messy and real. And I knew my answer. I had known it since the moment he'd first knocked on my door. "Okay," I said, my voice stronger now. "Okay." Marcus, a wave of relief washed over his face, so profound it was like watching a great weight being lifted from his shoulders. He smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his tired eyes. And in that moment, the last of my fortress walls crumbled into dust. He didn't leave that night. He stayed. We didn't fall into bed. We talked. We sat on the sofa, a respectable distance between us, and we laid out the broken pieces of our lives. He told me about the practicalities of his separation, the lawyers, the shared assets, the daunting tangle of unraveling a shared life. I told him about my quiet world, my fears, the deep-seated loneliness I had mistaken for contentment. It was a clarifying conversation, a negotiation of new territory. We were two cartographers, mapping out a strange and unknown country, admitting our fear of the journey, but agreeing to take the first step together. The next morning, I woke up first. I lay in bed for a moment, listening to the sound of his slow, deep breathing from the sofa. There was no panic this time, no anxiety, just a quiet, humming certainty. I slipped out of bed and went to the kitchen to make coffee. As the water heated, I looked at the small pile of sugar on my counter. A ridiculous, beautiful beginning. He came into the kitchen as the coffee was brewing, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He was wearing my clothes again, looking just as endearingly absurd as he had the first time. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, smiling. "Coffee's almost ready." He came and stood beside me, leaning against the counter. He didn't touch me, but his proximity was a comfort, a warm, solid presence in my small kitchen. We stood in a comfortable silence, watching the dark liquid drip into the pot. It felt domestic, natural. He picked up the keys to his truck, which he'd left on the counter. He detached a single key from the ring. It was a plain, brass house key. He held it out to me. "I don't live there anymore," he said quietly. "Not really. It's just a place with my stuff in it. But I want you to have this, so you know that I'm not running. So you know I'm coming back." It was a symbolic gesture, but it felt as solid and real as a vow. It was an act of commitment, an anchor. I took the key from his hand, its metal cool against my skin. "I'll have to get my own things out of there," he said, looking out the window toward his old life. "It's going to be a process. We'll figure it out," I said, and I was surprised by the conviction in my own voice. "We." It was a new word in my vocabulary. The weeks that followed were a blur of careful navigation. He moved a few of his things into my apartment, a duffel bag, a toothbrush. His large work boots by the door became a permanent fixture. My small, ordered world began to expand, making room for his comfortable chaos. The changes were small at first. A different brand of coffee in the cupboard. The sound of the television playing a sports game in the evening. The weight of him sleeping on my sofa every night. Slowly, he moved from the sofa to my bed. It was a transition that happened without words. One night, after a particularly grueling day of him sorting through the wreckage of his old life, I found him asleep on the sofa, his large frame contorted uncomfortably. I woke him gently. "Come to bed," I whispered. He followed me without argument, and we fell asleep in each other's arms. From then on, the sofa was just a sofa again. My bed was our bed. Life with him was not the perfect, romantic fantasy I had constructed in my head while watching from the window. It was real. It was waking up to his snoring. It was arguing about what to have for dinner. It was him leaving his socks on the floor and me arranging them by color in the laundry. It was messy and complicated and wonderful. My life, which had been a straight, predictable line, was now full of unexpected turns. Marcus was a disruption, a beautiful, chaotic force that had breached my walls and rearranged all my furniture. He filled the quiet spaces with his laughter, his stories, his presence. My solitude had not been contentment. It had been a waiting room. I just hadn't known who I was waiting for. One Saturday morning, months later, I was at my desk working. The window was open, and a warm breeze drifted in. I looked out, across the lawn, at his old house. A new family was moving in. A young couple, laughing as they carried in boxes. I felt a presence behind me and turned to see Marcus, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to me and stood behind my chair, his hand resting on my shoulder. "Strange, seeing other people in there," he said quietly. "Is it?" I asked. He was silent for a moment, watching them. "No," he said finally, his thumb stroking my shoulder. "It's just a house. This is home." I leaned my head back against his legs, looking up at him. The lines of exhaustion that had been etched so deeply on his face when he first appeared at my door were gone. He looked younger. He looked happy. He looked at peace. He was right. My small apartment, once a fortress against the world, had become our home. It wasn't the life I had meticulously planned, but it was so much better. It was a life I hadn't been brave enough to even dream of. All because of a storm, a lie about sugar, and a man who was brave enough to knock on a stranger's door and ask for shelter, not just from the rain, but from himself. He hadn't just been looking for a place to stay. He'd been looking for a place to belong. And in my quiet, orderly world, he had somehow found it. And in his chaotic, beautiful disruption, I had found it too.